The first sound wasn't a proclamation. It was a joke. A nervous, trembling joke in a smoke-filled room. 59 men were gathered around a table in Westminster. They weren't common cut-purses, mutineers, or back-alley cutthroats. They were Puritan generals, high court barristers, and country gentlemen in stiff, bleached collars. Before pressing his seal into the wax, one commander dipped his quill into the inkwell and playfully dragged it across the cheek of the man sitting beside him. They laughed, a thin, breathless sound that died as soon as the ink dried. They genuinely believed they were closing an era of tyranny. They believed that by putting ink to parchment, they were executing an idea rather than just a man. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, dressed in 2 heavy linen shirts. It was freezing, and he didn't want the thousands of onlookers gathering below the scaffold to mistake his shivering for fear. At 2 in the afternoon, he laid his neck upon a wooden block scarcely 10 inches high. 10 seconds later, the executioner raised a dripping, severed head to a crowd so completely paralyzed with horror that witnesses said the only sound was a single collective groan rising into the winter sky. 59 signatures. 59 deep red wax seals pressed into a single document. That is the number to remember. Because 11 years later, that very piece of parchment would transform into the most meticulously hunted kill list in English history. When the dead king's son finally returns to reclaim the throne, every promise of mercy will evaporate the moment his eyes hit those 59 names. By the time this story ends, every single one of them will have paid the butcher's bill. And the manner of their deaths is going to terrify you. One of them will be dragged through the streets on a wooden sledge, cut down from the noose while still breathing, and forced to watch his own steaming entrails cast into an open fire. One will be gunned down on the stone steps of a sanctuary in Switzerland by an assassin paid out of the royal treasury. 3 will cross the ocean and spend years hiding like rats in damp sea caves and hollow oak trees in the American wilderness, jumping at every snapped twig. And the men who were fortunate enough to die of old age before the reckoning arrived, the crown will dig their rotting corpses out of consecrated ground, drag them through the mud, and string their decaying remains up on a public gallows. None of them knows that yet. Right now, they are standing in a candlelit chamber, blowing the wet ink dry, convinced they have just freed an empire forever. They smashed the royal insignia, melted down the ancient crown jewels to mint currency for an army of iron-willed Puritans, and established a republic. At the summit of it all stood Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. A man who commanded 60,000 battle-hardened soldiers and ruled England with a grip tighter and colder than any king before him. The 59 signatories moved into confiscated aristocratic estates. They held high judicial posts, commanded fleets, governed provinces, and convinced themselves that the monarchy was a dead ghost that would never haunt them again. They forgot that history has an appetite for patience. 300 miles away, in the damp, drafty rented rooms of Flanders and France, the dead king's son was starving. Charles II was 19 years old when they took his father's head. For over a decade, he lived as a royal beggar. European monarchs who feared Cromwell's navy closed their doors to him. He wore threadbare coats, pawned his family's remaining jewels to buy bread, and watched his small court of exiled royalists bicker and starve.
He didn't have legions. He didn't have gold. He had 2 things: a cold, unflinching memory and a handwritten transcript of the 59 names stamped beneath his father's death warrant. Then, in September of 1658, the sky opened up over London. A storm so violent it tore roofs off houses ripped across the capital. And in the middle of that tempest, Oliver Cromwell died of malaria and kidney failure. The iron gear that kept the Republican machine turning was gone. Within 18 months, the Commonwealth devoured itself in political factionalism, unpaid mutinous regiments, and civic exhaustion. The people didn't want a holy Commonwealth anymore. They wanted bread, order, and an end to the Puritan curfew. In May of 1660, an English naval fleet arrived at the Dutch coast. They hadn't come to wage war. They had come to kneel.
When Charles II stepped ashore at Dover, 250,000 people cheered until their throats bled. The new king smiled, waved, and published the Declaration of Breda, promising a general pardon to all who had opposed his crown. He promised to forgive virtually everyone in the British Isles, except 59 men. The amnesty vanished the second the king reached London. An act of indemnity and oblivion was drafted, specifically naming every living judge, executioner, and officer who had signed, managed, or assisted in the execution of Charles I. The hunt was officially open. 59 names on the slate, and the clock was ticking.
The first man to feel the jaws of the trap snap shut was Major General Thomas Harrison. Harrison was the most unyielding religious extremist of the group. He believed the execution of the king was literally the opening act of the Book of Revelation. When the Restoration happened, his fellow conspirators urged him to abandon his estate, dress as a peasant, and catch a merchant vessel to the continent. Harrison refused. He said, "If I run now, I tell the world that my God is small." He stayed in his study, praying by candlelight, until the king's horsemen broke down his heavy front door. His trial lasted only hours. The sentence handed down to Harrison and the first wave of captured judges was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the medieval penalty for high treason, designed not just to kill, but to systematically deconstruct the human body in public. On October 13th, 1660, Harrison was loaded onto a wooden sledge and dragged through the howling streets to Charing Cross, within plain sight of the very banqueting hall where Charles I had stepped onto the scaffold.
They strung him up by the neck until he was turning purple, then cut the rope before he lost consciousness. He crashed onto the timber platform, fully awake. The executioner pinned him down, sliced open his abdomen, and pulled his living entrails out to burn them in a brazier right before his eyes. Witnesses recorded that in an incomprehensible spasm of agony and sheer will, Harrison suddenly pushed himself up on his elbows and struck the executioner across the face before the butcher's knife took his head. 4 days later, John Carew, John Jones, Gregory Clement, and Thomas Scott were butchered on the exact same planks. When Scott reached the ladder, he attempted to deliver a final speech defending the Republic. The royal officers ordered the drummers to beat their snares directly beneath the gallows to drown out his voice. Their severed heads were collected by the executioner's apprentices, dropped into cast-iron cauldrons boiling with salt and cumin to prevent birds from devouring them too quickly, and then impaled on iron pikes along London Bridge and the city gates. 52 names remained, and the surviving judges realized that staying within 300 leagues of the English Channel was a death sentence.
For the men who escaped the initial sweep, borders meant nothing. Charles II hired a man named Sir George Downing to lead the hunt. Downing was a creature of singular malice. He had once been a devoted chaplain in Cromwell's own army, but the moment the wind turned, he traded his old comrades' lives for a knighthood and a fat royal pension. He knew how the regicides thought. He knew their aliases, and he knew their safe houses. In early 1662, Downing tracked 3 signatories, John Barkstead, Miles Corbett, and John Okey, to the Dutch Republic. They were living under forged papers, dressed as quiet merchants trading cloth and grain. Downing bypassed diplomatic channels, bribed local magistrates with English coin,
and personally led an armed raid into their safe house at midnight. He had them locked in heavy irons in the bilge of a royal frigate before the local burghers even realized what had happened. Within 2 weeks of their arrest on foreign soil, all three were hanging side by side at Tyburn, their bodies quartered and salted. In Switzerland, John Lyell, another high-ranking judge, believed the Alpine peaks and Swiss neutrality would guarantee his survival. He settled in Lausanne and never walked outside without 4 armed guards. It didn't matter.
On a bright Sunday morning in August 1664, Lyell was stepping up the stone stairs of the town's church. A tall man in a leather cloak rode into the square, pulled a heavy double-barreled carbine from beneath his mantle, and shot Lyell directly through the back from point-blank range. As Lyell collapsed into his own blood, the assassin shouted, "Vive le Roi!" spurred his horse, and vanished into the mountain passes toward the French border. He was an Irish mercenary, collecting a bounty paid directly from Whitehall. Then came the three who vanished beyond the edge of the known world. Generals Edward Whalley and William Goff, father-in-law and son-in-law, along with Judge John Dixwell, purchased passage on a ship sailing for Boston, Massachusetts. When the King's royal commissioners arrived in New England with warrants for their execution, the 3 judges retreated into the dark, uncharted wilderness of Connecticut. For months, Whalley and Goff lived inside a damp cavern formed by giant basalt boulders at the top of West Rock near New Haven, now known as the Judge's Cave. Sympathetic local Puritans crept into the woods at night to leave them salt pork, bread, and water. When colonial trackers closed in, they crawled into hollowed-out tree trunks and waded through swamps to break the hound's scent. Dixwell changed his name to James Davids, married a local woman who never knew his true identity, and lived for 30 years in plain sight as a quiet country clerk. Whalley and Goff slowly went blind and mad in secret cellars and forest shacks, jumping every time the floorboards creaked above their heads. They died in hiding, forgotten by the world, buried in unmarked graves under false initials, so the English crown could never claim their remains. 59 men sat in a room in 1649 and signed an order they believed would kill an absolute monarch and save their nation. It took 30 years, 2 oceans, and hundreds of bounty hunters. But not a single one of those 59 lived to see the republic they bled for take root. They executed a sovereign to eradicate the throne. And when the dust settled, the throne was standing right where they left it, occupied by the very boy who had watched them butcher his father, holding their names in his hand. If you made it this far, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the darker corridors of history. Until next time.